board couldn't possibly meet that criteria for a number of reasons. One, they weren't accepting everyone who was looking for a flight, but they were reviewing and would accept it only if they wanted to go on a flight with that person. And then two, they weren't profiting. The common law definition of this states that you have to be a major enterprise for profit. And that was not possible with pilots sharing on FlightNow. In fact, if they did 1,000 flights, they would have less money than when they started. So it wasn't possible for them to profit by any means under that regime. But this is where, in court, the FAA said, well, you're getting compensated, so we consider that to be for profit.
Yeah, so to the FAA's interpretation, so the FAA issued an advisory circular in 1986 that basically said anyone holding out to transport persons or items from place to place for compensation is a common carrier. And with that came all sorts of legal requirements and all sorts of certification and licensing with that classification as a common carrier. Now, something that you mentioned earlier is that the FAA's interpretation of who is and is not a common carrier, and then the Court of Appeals approving that interpretation or upholding their interpretation contravenes hundreds of years of common law, right? So typically, people would contract with one another to do this, and you aren't a common carrier if if I contract with you to fly me somewhere, or drive me somewhere, I'm not a common carrier. The common carrier definition was a set of defaults for people who aren't engaged in contract setting for themselves, the terms and conditions between themselves. And the FAA just takes these common law rules, or these common law words, and just turn them into something different. So you became this binary, you're either a private carrier or a common carrier, and the second you verge into being a common carrier, you're stuck there, and by the way, all of these requirements come with you. So in the case of FlightNow, what the FAA said was, because you're posting online, you're holding out, and you're transporting persons and items from place to place. And even though it's a pro rata share, it's still compensation. You're still receiving money. Therefore, you're a common carrier. And that was it. There's no contracting around it. There's no wiggle room, and that was it. And at that point now, every private pilot now had to become a commercial pilot, right? So much higher bar to meet, which then left, for all intents and purposes, every single pilot in your platform, out in the cold.
And not just that, but it required a business aviation license. And in order to get that, you actually have to submit a business plan on how you intend to make a profit, which is impossible under this regime. So it was really what they were asking for just did not make any sense. And the fact is, it's the same plane, the same pilot, the same passengers. They just communicated a different way, whether it was online or offline. And that totally changed the legality of the flight.
So I guess that brings us to our next topic point. Is the FAA too risk averse? What exactly are the risks that the FAA is concerned with, and how is their model kind of adapting to meet the consumer preferences in this market compared to its assessment of risks?
I don't know if you want to.
Well, sure. So I think the big one that people like to bring up is safety. And I think the last statement really addresses that is these are the same pilots, the same aircraft, maintained the same way, whether the passengers found the pilot online or on a bulletin board. And currently it's legal on a bulletin board. So to make the claim that the flight becomes less safe by the connecting of the pilot and passenger happening online just doesn't make any sense. The flight is going to happen regardless. It's going to be the same people, same route. Nothing changes when it happens online. However, when it does happen online, we can actually provide more insight to the passenger, more insight to the pilot. We can tell them, hey, there's some bad weather up here. Have you seen that? We can give the pilot more resources to actually make the flight safer.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember at the FAA, the fine men and women at the Federal Aviation Administration, they are a safety agency. First and foremost, their statutory charge is safety. They've been given that as their mission, right? They've been told, make commercial civil aviation safe. Like that's your job. And so there shouldn't be too much of a surprise that the agency prioritizes safety over everything else. I mean, that's what they're told to do by Congress, right? So some of this isn't just saying that the Federal Aviation Administration is too risk averse, but the charge that's been given to them by Congress makes them that way. So we've talked a lot about the Federal Aviation Administration, but this is as much Congress doing this as well.
Would everyone please silence their cell phones? Thank you.
Yeah, and giving them the charge to be safe, right? Saying make it safe, and so that's like safety at any cost, right? And you have to remember, you look at the data, like general aviation relative to commercial aviation is unsafer, right? There are more accidents, there are more fatalities in general aviation than there are, in big commercial flights. The question is, what's the driving cause of those fatalities and those accidents? And can platforms like FlightNow actually reduce those accidents from happening as opposed to encouraging people to be less safe or take more risks in the flights that they take?
And that's what's interesting, and where I think the FAA sometimes misses the mark is that they're looking often at the number of incidents that happen, so the number of fatalities, the number of crashes, but that's not the number to be looking at, because as you reduce the number of flights that happen, you're going to get less accidents. You're not improving safety that way. But if you can make the rate at which those accidents are happening, if we can reduce that, then you're actually making it safer. And I know we've worked together on some research on this. We actually downloaded the entire NTSB database and analyzed it to see what is causing these crashes, and is there a way that we can restrict certain types of flights to make it safer? And the data is fascinating, because you see that a very high percentage, I think it was 75 or 80% of all accidents are weather related. So on FlightNow, if we know the weather, we can just say, all right, well, we'll cancel a flight if the weather is even looking marginally bad. That right there, 80% of the flights. And then another 25% involve flights with experimental aircraft or self-built aircraft. And if we eliminate those from the site as well, then that can also make it safer. So there are ways to dramatically increase the safety in general aviation just by adopting technology. But instead, the FAA has taken the position of, well, let's just keep having it offline, no data on what's going on, and by restricting the amount of flights, then we're going to make aviation safer, and that's just not the case.
Yeah, and it's also important to understand, the NTSB that you mentioned, the National Transportation Safety Board, right? Like they're charged investigating accidents when they happen. So they have all this data on accidents. And a colleague of mine, Michael Koutros, and I have really dug into that data, because over the past 20 years, when people look at this, they say, well, the reduction, if you look at the decline in accidents and fatalities over the last 10 to 20 years in general aviation, it's sort of like you could eyeball correlation with a reduction in activity, right? We have fewer general aviation airplanes in the skies, and people sort of just intuitively say, well, of course, then we will have fewer accidents. But when you actually start to control for a number of factors, you find we are, in fact, getting safer, right? General aviation is, in fact, getting safer. And then you take into account the fact that, an overwhelming majority of the accidents and the fatal accidents in general aviation are encounters with weather. So these are people who are flying into storms, right? So once you take that equation out, you can make general aviation a lot safer, and platforms like FlightNow can do that, right? They can auto cancel flights if at any point in the route the pilot is going to encounter weather. Now contrast that with the analog, the physical corkboard model, where you go to an airport and you get a tearaway with a number, and then you call the pilot, and the pilot says, yeah, I'll totally fly you. I'm heading in the same direction. Well, we'll do this next Tuesday, right? And then you sort of just trust the pilot, right? There's no one else there. There's no third-party sort of verification to ensure that, safety steps have been taken. There's a huge information asymmetry, right? You don't even know the pilots.
You don't even know that they are a pilot.
History, right? You're just assuming, you're taking them at their word, where these platforms can verify, they can maintain data on flights, they can do the types of things, for any of you who took an Uber here today, they can do the same types of things that any of the other transportation apps are doing, where you are gathering more data as you rate a pilot's or a driver's trip. So at the end of it, FlightNow could say, look, we understand that you're current and you have all of the basic requirements to be a pilot, but people don't like flying with you, right? You're just not, the safest, most enjoyable pilot. Therefore, we're gonna, politely ask you out of the system. I don't know what, if you've ever encountered that, but these platforms can do this in a way that no one's controlling who's posting on the corkboard, right? So you're actually, by driving people off apps and back onto digital corkboards, you're increasing the likelihood that accidents are going to happen. You may actually be, furthering unsafe practices rather than, taking the European model and working with apps and platforms to encourage and promote safety in general aviation.
So this kind of brings me to a different question. Since 2014, since this has kind of come up in the market space, have there been developments in the commercial aviation market that have kind of driven a need for this sort of sector to come through? For example, commercial purchases of seats and block seating to make people feel in a certain way or another about where they're put, or food or leg space, or any of the little accoutrements that come with commercial travel.
Well, who here enjoyed having to go on their previous flight? Yeah, I don't think anyone did. It's really, really just a bad experience today. And when you contrast that with private flying, well, first look at the options, right? So you've got commercial aviation. It's low cost, but a really bad experience. Then you've got private aviation. So think like a private jet. Extremely expensive, but it's a really, really nice way to travel. You just walk right up to your jet. There's no security. You can get there 10 minutes before the flight's supposed to take off. It's a much better experience. And then you've got ride sharing in aviation. And with small planes, this becomes really interesting because you could do something, say, Boston to Martha's Vineyard for maybe $70 round trip. And you get all the benefits of private aviation, but without the cost, because you're splitting that. And that really makes it compelling. So I think the other big thing about it is that you're doing non-hub. So if you're flying from Boston to upstate New York, for example, you're going to connect through New York City, and then you're going to have to take another flight up because it's based on the hub model. But with small planes, they're flying to regional every single day, and they're flying with empty seats. We just want to capture those empty seats and help fill those planes.
And before I add to that, what was the average cost when FlightNow was operating? What was the average cost for many of the flights that were posted?
It was about $100.
This is like relatively,
yeah.
All things considered, relatively, like, good luck finding a commercial flight for $100. But I would ask two questions, if I could poll the audience real quick, right?
Oh, okay.
Two questions. How many of you have ever flown past your destination, right, to have a layover to fly backwards somewhere? Yeah, is a third of the room. How many of you have ever been stranded at an airport by an airline that their pilots hit their limit, or if you were involved in the Atlanta outage around Christmas last year,